She was black, seated in 1A, and humiliated before the cabin doors even sealed shut. The flight attendant spat on her, called her disruptive, and stripped her of her dignity like it was part of the in-flight service. No warning, no reason, just calculated cruelty, delivered with a smile and watched in silence by a cabin full of people who looked away. Her water never came. Her bag was taken. Her every move was treated like a threat. She didn't shout. She didn't protest. She sat in silence while judgment spread through whispers and sideways glances, each one cutting deeper than the last. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was who they were really trying to break. She wasn't powerless. She was patient. And every second they underestimated her pushed them closer to the fallout that would cost billions and ruin careers. If this story hit you, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. What would you have done in her seat? Where are you watching from? Let's talk about what silence really says. The cabin doors had just sealed with that familiar hydraulic hiss, the last click of routine sealing passengers inside an atmosphere of wealth, order, and soft privilege. First class aboard this transatlantic flight was a world apart from the rest of the plane, a cocoon of polished walnut paneling, supple leather, and chilled glasses of pre-takeoff champagne. The lights were dimmed to a golden hue, bathing the seats in a kind of hushed opulence. Flight attendant Charlotte Whitmore moved through the aisle like she was born to it, her navy blazer crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a taut bun that hadn't shifted in the last 5 hours of prep and boarding. She smiled at the familiar faces, the frequent flyers in custom-tailored suits, the celebrity interior designer sipping cucumber water, the old money socialite clutching her Louis Vuitton tote like a lifeline. She was in her element. She didn't just work first class, she curated it. She'd memorized the details that mattered, knew how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, and she had little patience for those who didn't belong. As she prepared to close out the manifest check on her tablet, a figure entered the front cabin from the jet bridge. Ariel Monroe moved with quiet ease, dressed in a soft ivory blouse tucked into high-waisted navy trousers, with a camel trench folded over one arm. Her presence didn't announce itself. There was no ostentatious display, no designer logo shouting wealth. But it was in the way she walked, measured, upright, unhurried, that you could sense she wasn't new to this. Her boarding pass was already in hand. Charlotte's eyes flicked up at her instinctively. The moment was brief, but enough to spark something beneath the surface. Not concern, not confusion, a tickle of distrust. Ariel stopped at seat 1A, lifted her bag into the overhead bin with a practiced motion, and sat down. No hesitation, no glance around for approval. Just a seat taken, calmly and confidently. Charlotte walked forward, her smile perfectly symmetrical, but her eyes cool. "Good evening," she said in that trademark flight attendant tone, smooth, polite, and mildly insistent. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Ariel glanced up and extended the slip of paper without pause. Charlotte took it, held it longer than necessary, then looked down at the tablet in her other hand as if confirming a puzzle piece. She murmured. "Seat 1A. She looked at the pass again. "Right." Her smile was thin when she handed it back. "Just double-checking. Thank you." Her voice was courteous, her posture was rigid, and the implication was loud without being spoken. She turned and walked away, but not before shooting a glance to her co-attendant May, who was organizing meal carts by the galley. "Everything okay?" May asked. Charlotte shrugged, voice low. "Manifest looks right. Just thought we had a mix-up. We're good." But her eyes flicked back toward 1A. The seat didn't look wrong. It was just the person in it that unsettled her. Ariel opened her tablet and tapped through a few files. She looked calm, but something in her gut had tightened. She knew that look, that tone, that unspoken pause. The kind that says, "You're not supposed to be here. This isn't for you." She'd seen it before, in boardrooms, in hotel lobbies, in meetings where she was the only one like her in the room. She adjusted her wristwatch and returned her gaze to the screen. She wasn't going to give the moment her energy. But the flight had just begun. Charlotte resumed service, starting from the back of first class and working forward. She offered a warm towel and welcome drink to the couple in 3B and 3A, then to the suited man in 2B. She skipped 1A entirely. No glance, no acknowledgement, just passed the row as if it were empty. Ariel noticed. She folded her hands in her lap and didn't speak. Her silence wasn't defeat. It was endurance. A calculated calm. Charlotte returned with the beverage cart, took special care pouring champagne into fluted glasses for the older gentleman in 1B and the middle-aged woman in 2A. She again bypassed 1A. It was intentional, not a mistake. Ariel watched the edge of the cart disappear down the aisle again. A bead of tension pressed against her chest, not enough to unravel her poise, but enough to twist under the skin. She'd bought this ticket outright, just like anyone else in this cabin. No upgrade, no favors, no handouts. It was her seat. But privilege didn't always shield you. Dignity didn't always defend you. The next time Charlotte walked past, she leaned down as though to whisper something confidential. Please ensure your tablet is in airplane mode before takeoff. I'll need to verify it's powered down. Ariel showed her the screen, airplane icon clearly visible. It is, she said quietly. Charlotte stood a beat longer than necessary, then walked on. She didn't check anyone else's tablet. Ariel turned off the screen completely, laid the tablet on her lap, and exhaled. She looked out the window, the terminal lights fading as the aircraft began pushback. A few passengers nearby had noticed, but said nothing. The older man in 1B glanced over, then back to his paper. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming them aboard, detailing the flight time, weather at the destination. It was routine, normal. But Ariel's mind was far from routine. She was replaying every small moment, each one a slight weight, piling into a collective gravity. She'd been excited to fly. This was supposed to be her first real moment of pause after a long stretch of overwork. She was on her way to a diplomatic summit as an advisor to a foreign policy council. It wasn't a vacation, but it was something she'd earned. The seat, the space, the moment. A sense of quiet isolation wrapped around her like a vice. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from 1,000 silent offenses carried over time, each one sharpened into a tool used to carve you out of spaces you rightfully entered. Charlotte Whitmore, still carrying her polished mask, moved down the aisle with the beverage cart again, distributing drinks, striking up soft conversations with select passengers, exuding charm in bursts that never extended toward row 1A. She made a deliberate show of crouching down to ask the couple in 1B if they like sparkling or still water, even offering lemon wedges with a practiced flick of tongs. Then, straightening, she rolled the cart forward, right past Ariel, without a word. No eye contact, no offer, nothing. Ariel blinked slowly, pressed her palms against her thighs, and said nothing. Her dignity weighed heavily against the rising sting in her throat. The man in 2B looked up from his tablet, met Ariel's gaze briefly, then looked away with the faintest trace of discomfort in his eyes. Charlotte was careful, always careful, but her intentions were now undeniable. 10 minutes later, when another attendant, May, passed through with a tray of snacks, Charlotte intercepted her. A hushed exchange followed near the galley door, and when May proceeded forward, she too bypassed 1A. The tray stopped at 1B, then resumed at 2A. Ariel's row, again, was made invisible. By then, it had escalated from omission to orchestration. This wasn't inattentiveness. This was control. This was targeting disguised as professionalism. And still, Ariel did not react. Instead, she reached into her leather handbag, pulled out a small packet of almonds she'd packed from home, and quietly ate 2 before sliding them back into the zippered pocket. When May re-entered the galley, her brow was furrowed. "Was there a reason we skipped 1A?" she asked. Charlotte didn't glance up. "Just handling a passenger issue," she murmured. "Security protocol. Best to avoid contact unless necessary." May looked unconvinced. "She seems fine to me." Charlotte turned slowly. "Trust me," she said. "We're just playing it safe." She said it with the serene detachment of someone administering policy, not bigotry. But her eyes said something else, something smug and cold and self-satisfied. Minutes later, as dinner service began, Charlotte approached Ariel's seat for the first time since boarding. Her tone was sharp, her posture rigid, no longer wrapped in the veil of warmth she wore with other passengers. "Ma'am," she said crisply, "I'll need to speak with you privately." Ariel looked up slowly. Her face betrayed nothing. "About what?" Charlotte forced a smile. "A quick review of our safety policies. I'll explain in the galley." She said it loud enough to draw attention from a few rows back. Ariel rose, gathered her tablet and jacket with quiet efficiency, and followed Charlotte without a word. Inside the galley, the hum of refrigeration units filled the tight space. Charlotte turned, crossed her arms, and stared directly at her. "I've received a complaint," she said. "One of the passengers stated you were behaving erratically during boarding." Ariel blinked once, slowly. "From whom?" Charlotte shrugged. "I'm not permitted to say. But for the safety of the cabin, I've documented the interaction. You'll remain in your seat, but any further disruption may result in removal upon landing." The audacity of it was staggering. Ariel had not raised her voice. She had not resisted any instruction. She had not even spoken beyond necessity. "Documented what?" Ariel asked. Her voice was calm but edged in steel. "That I sat in the seat I paid for? That I turned off my tablet? That I didn't receive a drink or towel like the others?" Charlotte smiled, but it was a thin, brittle thing. "I'm just following procedure." Ariel stepped back, shook her head once, and returned to her seat. She sat down, adjusted her belt, and reopened her tablet, but the words on the screen blurred beneath the pressure building behind her eyes. Charlotte followed with a tray minutes later, holding Ariel's meal. The dish was covered with foil and offered without a word. She set it down with a clatter, then turned away before Ariel could respond. It was barely warm. The sauce had separated. The vegetables looked dry, and unlike the gourmet plating she'd seen served elsewhere, her meal looked like an afterthought. She didn't touch it. From across the aisle, the woman in one glanced at the tray, then up at Ariel. Their eyes met. There was something like guilt in her expression. She shifted in her seat, looked away. Ariel returned to her tablet and tried to resume reading her notes for the summit, but her mind wandered. The facts were there, the schedule, the draft speeches, but the room inside her where preparation usually took shape was already eroding. She felt herself being pulled out of the moment, out of the skin of her authority, because power means little when dignity is under siege. And that was what this was. Not a series of accidents, not mistakes. It was slow deconstruction, an effort to provoke, to diminish, to force a reaction that could be used against her. Later, Charlotte stopped by a few rows back and struck up a conversation with a passenger in 2C. She spoke just loud enough for her voice to carry forward. "We've had issues before," she said. "You never really know who gets into first class these days. Sometimes they book through loopholes or promotions. Doesn't always reflect the clientele we're used to." The passenger mumbled something. Charlotte laughed softly. "Exactly. That sense of refinement. It's getting harder to maintain." Ariel didn't react. Her shoulders remained square, her expression flat, but inside, the ache twisted deeper. These weren't words meant for her, but they were designed to be heard. That was the point. Make it unbearable. Make it personal, without making it actionable. She inhaled slowly and closed her eyes, not because she was tired, but because she needed to hold herself inside, keep from unraveling. When May returned for drink refills later, she offered Ariel a glass of sparkling water, quiet and apologetic. Ariel accepted it with a nod. May hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If you need anything," she said, "just ask me directly." Ariel looked up. Charlotte Whitmore, on the other hand, had not softened. If anything, she had grown more emboldened, fed by the quiet success of each microaggression, each passive dismissal that had gone unchallenged. Control was power, and she believed she held it fully. Charlotte returned once more with a checklist in hand, pretending to reinspect seat rows and belt positions for the second time. As she approached 1A, she paused deliberately, then lowered her voice just enough to imply importance. "Ma'am," she said, her tone clipped and hollow, "we've received another concern regarding your presence in this cabin. I need to ask again that you be cooperative." Ariel blinked, her tone steady despite the sting behind her eyes. "Concern from whom? I've complied with every instruction." Charlotte leaned closer, her breath barely audible. "From someone who says you were using unauthorized equipment. If you'd like to discuss it further, I can involve the captain." The threat hung there like a blade. Ariel did not respond. She glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Charlotte, who gave a tight smile and moved on. Her words had not been loud, but they were loud enough. Passengers 2 rows back had turned their heads. The woman in 1B shifted away subtly. No one said anything, but everyone had heard the implication. Suspicion had now been painted onto Ariel's presence with professional ease. Minutes later, as Ariel reached into her bag for a tissue, Charlotte returned. Without warning, without invitation, she leaned over and pulled the handbag from Ariel's lap. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to secure this for the remainder of the flight," she said, as if reciting a regulation. Ariel's hand gripped the strap instinctively. "That's personal property," she said, voice tight. Charlotte smiled with cold finality. "You can collect it upon landing." The exchange happened so fast that no one had time to react. But heads turned. The tension rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Ariel's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. She released the bag, not because she consented, but because she understood. Any resistance could be spun into aggression. Any protest could become justification. Charlotte returned to the galley, her prize in hand. She stowed it beside the service cart and made a performative note on her tablet. Ariel sat back in her seat, her chest rising and falling in shallow waves. Her mouth felt dry, and her thoughts clouded. She had endured so much already, but this moment of public violation cut deeper than silence. This was no longer private humiliation. This was spectacle. This was message. Moments later, Charlotte returned to her aisle and approached the intercom. Her voice broadcast through the cabin, smooth and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. For your safety, we ask that passengers refrain from using unauthorized electronics. If you have questions, please direct them to the flight crew." She didn't say a name. She didn't need to. Ariel could feel the cabin watching her, not with open hostility, but with the uncomfortable curiosity that builds when something seems out of place. She was being cast as a disruption, quietly, subtly, with surgical precision. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. What mattered was perception, and Charlotte had twisted perception like a weapon. The man in 2C whispered to his partner. The woman in 3A pulled her bag closer to her feet. The businessman in 1B gave Ariel a stiff glance, then looked out the window. Even the smallest gestures became damning in a room like this. Ariel looked down at her hands, her fingers still curled from the moment she tried to hold onto her bag. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. Not because she lacked authority or credentials, but because power in this cabin was not about truth. It was about control of the narrative. Charlotte's narrative. May approached hesitantly again, offering a bottle of water. Ariel took it with a nod, but their eyes didn't meet. May looked ashamed. A few seats back, a young man in 4A typed something into his phone, glanced discreetly at Ariel, then looked away. It was a small thing, a flicker of humanity. But it was distant, and it came too late. Charlotte returned again, standing beside Ariel as if to reinforce the image of monitoring. "Please remain in your seat for the duration of the flight," she said, "and do not attempt to retrieve your belongings." Her tone was rehearsed, but her eyes glimmered with something more primal. It wasn't just duty. It was triumph. She believed she had won. She believed she had broken something. Ariel said nothing. She had nothing left to say that wouldn't be used against her. She turned her head and stared out the window, watching the white streaks of cloud below blur into each other. The world outside moved forward while the cabin around her remained frozen in tension. Behind her, whispers stirred again. Passengers lowered their voices, but their curiosity was louder than they realized. They wanted to know what she had done. They wanted to understand what had warranted such treatment. And because they did not know her, because they had no context, they assumed the worst. Ariel remained still. If she cried, they would see it as guilt. If she spoke, they would hear hostility. If she stood, they might call it escalation. Her only weapon left was her silence. She had never felt smaller. Not in foreign meetings. Not in press briefings. Not even in the countless boardrooms where she'd stood as the only woman of color in a sea of power suits. This was different. This was personal in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't about what she had done. It was about who she was. And Charlotte knew it. Charlotte knew from the moment Ariel stepped onto the plane that she would find a way to dismantle her. They didn't have the full story, but they had just enough insinuation to create their own. The damage had taken root, and Charlotte moved with a quiet pride, glancing toward Ariel every so often as if checking on the cage she'd built around her. She wasn't just maintaining control anymore. She was making sure her narrative held. In the galley, Charlotte stood with her back to the cabin, tapping rapidly on her airline-issue tablet. She pulled up Ariel's seat information again and opened an incident log. She selected a code used for passenger noncompliance, electronic interference, and began filling in fabricated details. Subject was observed using unauthorized personal equipment, she typed. Failed to follow direct instructions to power down device during taxi and climb. Passenger became verbally defensive when questioned. Purser intervention recommended. She paused, then added another sentence. Behavior consistent with past security concerns observed in similar passenger profiles. Her hands hovered for a second, then tapped send. Within seconds, the entry synced with the flight's internal crew network. She turned, satisfied, just as May entered the galley with an empty tray. May barely glanced at her. "You're logging a report?" Charlotte gave a short nod. "Protocol. In case there's a follow-up." May hesitated. There's nothing to follow up on. She's been quiet the entire time. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "You're new to this route. Sometimes silence is the problem. People like that, they don't always act out loud. They manipulate quietly. Entitlement comes in all forms." May said nothing. She wiped down a tray, her shoulders stiff. "What are you saying?" Charlotte's voice lowered. "I'm saying this passenger was flagged in boarding. I'm saying we have a responsibility to keep the cabin safe. I'm saying she's not who she pretends to be." May blinked. "Flagged? I didn't see anything in the manifest." Charlotte shrugged. "Not everything's in the manifest." It was a lie, but one she delivered with confidence. Lies told often enough in uniform begin to sound like facts. Charlotte moved past her, re-entering the cabin. Ariel remained motionless in her seat, her arms folded gently across her stomach. Every muscle in her body was braced, not in panic, but in weary anticipation. She could feel something shifting, the weight of it bearing down in ways that didn't yet make sense. She wasn't sure how far Charlotte intended to take this, but she knew now it wasn't about a power trip. It was about erasure. It was about the kind of systematic destruction that wraps itself in policy and smiles while it cuts. In row 2A, a man in his 50s leaned over to his wife and whispered, "She must have done something." The wife glanced toward Ariel, then nodded faintly. They wouldn't go that far without a reason. Words like those had followed Ariel her entire career. They had clung to her in meetings where she wasn't expected, echoed behind her back in conference rooms where she'd outperformed everyone in the room. She had built a career on silence and perfection, knowing that the slightest crack would be enough to justify exclusion. And now, without having said a word, her image was being reshaped in real time. Charlotte returned again with a sterile smile and held out a form. "Per security guidelines, I'll need your signature to acknowledge removal of your property from your possession during flight. Standard procedure. Refusal to sign will be noted." Ariel accepted the form. Her eyes scanned the text, but every line was a lie. The document claimed she had breached protocol, that she had failed to comply, that her items had been taken for passenger and crew safety. She said nothing. She signed it with a steady hand. Charlotte took it and walked away without another word. In the cockpit, the purser received the incident report on his monitor and frowned. He radioed the cabin. "Charlotte, confirm passenger in 1A is secured and compliant." Charlotte responded swiftly. "Confirmed. Situation under control. No disturbance, but behavior suggests elevated observation. Will brief post-flight." The pilot listened. He had flown 1,000 routes and seen 100 incidents, but something about the tone gave him pause. Still, procedure was procedure. He marked the passenger profile with a soft flag for follow-up, then returned to flight navigation. Meanwhile, at the corporate operations center, the internal systems logged the report into a larger behavioral database. The entry was flagged low priority, buried beneath a dozen similar cases across the airline's network. Nobody verified the claims. Nobody questioned the context. Data doesn't require truth, it only requires entry. And Charlotte knew it. Back in first class, May brought Ariel a fresh cup of water without prompting. She didn't say anything, just placed it gently on the tray and paused long enough for their eyes to meet. Ariel gave the faintest nod. It was the only recognition she could afford without exposing May to risk. A few rows back, a man in 3C adjusted his laptop and angled his camera toward the front. He didn't know Ariel's name. He didn't know what had really happened. But something felt wrong. He tapped the record button and let the video run. Charlotte, unaware, moved confidently through the cabin again. She paused briefly at each row, checked seatbelts, whispered a few rehearsed reassurances to passengers who had witnessed her actions earlier. "Just a routine procedure," she murmured. "It's all under control." She repeated the phrase 3 times, ensuring that no one would ask questions later. Ariel remained silent. Her thoughts circled like hawks. She was calculating, observing, waiting. She didn't know how many people Charlotte had managed to sway. She didn't know what had been written, what had been logged, or what might follow her when this flight landed. But she knew something else now, something deeper and colder than all the rest. Charlotte wasn't acting alone. She was working with the system, a system that didn't require evidence, only perception. No one had confronted her directly since the last interaction with Charlotte. No one had dared raise their voice, but the damage lingered in the glances, in the whispers, in the tension humming beneath every minor interaction. Her body remained in first class, but the way they looked at her now, she was no longer a guest. She was a tolerated anomaly. Charlotte's deception had settled into place like dust on glass, thin and translucent, but enough to distort what people thought they saw. She had created a story, fabricated a disruption, and sold it to the passengers with quiet authority. And now that story was being passed hand to hand like gospel. Ariel, though, had stopped absorbing. She had shifted. She no longer felt the weight of humiliation pushing her down. She had begun processing. Charlotte had laid the battlefield, and now Ariel was studying it, quietly, intently, like a strategist before the storm. She knew her enemy. She understood the game, and she understood that there were rules she hadn't used yet. Her eyes tracked the cabin slowly, methodically. In seat 3C, the man with the laptop, an analyst judging by the graphs she'd glimpsed on his screen earlier, glanced toward her again. She noticed the faint green glow of a camera icon on his device. He had been recording. It was subtle, and he tried to mask it, but she saw it. Their eyes met for half a second, and his expression flickered, surprise, maybe shame, but then it hardened into something more neutral. He looked away. Still, it was enough. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She hadn't fought back. But someone else had noticed. She leaned her head slightly to the side, as if stretching her neck, and used the moment to glance toward the galley. Charlotte was there, typing on her device again, sipping from a white paper cup, as if nothing in the world needed her attention more than whatever task sat on that small screen. May stood further back, organizing small bottles of liquor, her shoulders tense, her motions precise. Something about the way she moved told Ariel she hadn't bought into Charlotte's story. Not fully. May had offered her water. She had lingered longer than regulation allowed. She had looked her in the eyes when no one else would. Small things, but real. Across the cabin, the couple in 2A began whispering again. The man shook his head slowly, gesturing subtly toward Ariel's row. The woman leaned in, murmuring something that ended with a faint chuckle. Ariel didn't need to hear the words. She'd seen that behavior before. In boardrooms where men laughed quietly while she presented, in diplomatic circles where her qualifications were doubted not because they were weak, but because they didn't come wrapped in the skin they expected. She had been underestimated before. It wasn't new, but this time they had no idea just how wrong they were. Slowly, she shifted in her seat and reached into her coat pocket, retrieving a slim, silver phone. It wasn't her standard device. It was a secure model, reserved for emergencies or classified communications. It had been untouched since boarding, left in airplane mode as required, untouched even as Charlotte launched her quiet campaign of humiliation. But now it was time. She opened the device, double-checked the cabin pressure and signal markers, and then quietly tapped out a message. Flight 611, first class seat 1A. Situation compromised. Passenger safety threatened. Secure all logs. Confirm ID lock. Maintain passive watch. She encrypted the message and sent it through a narrow band reserved for diplomatic clearance. Within seconds, the message disappeared, routed through a global node system designed to avoid detection. No one saw it. No alerts chimed. No lights blinked. Ariel returned the device to her pocket and resumed her stillness. Minutes passed. Then her own airline-issued in-flight screen flickered once. A silent notification appeared in the lower corner. Confirmed. Data lock engaged. Stand by for surveillance sync. Her request had been received. That meant the clock had started. Charlotte had unknowingly triggered a review chain above her authority, and it was now moving silently through layers of protocol designed for exactly these scenarios, when someone important was being targeted, and no one on the plane knew who they truly were. Ariel remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't react. But her body relaxed by degrees. In the galley, Charlotte continued chatting with another attendant, oblivious. She laughed once, a sharp laugh, and shook her head at something on the tablet screen. She seemed lighter now, as if the situation had passed. In her mind, she had neutralized the passenger in 1A. She had taken the threat and turned it into silence. She believed she had won. But May remained watchful. She moved through the cabin with more deliberate pace, pausing once near Ariel's seat and bending down. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Ariel glanced at her. Her expression was calm but firm. "Yes, thank you." It was the first time she had spoken all flight, and May hesitated at the sound. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't panic. It was control. And May saw it. She nodded once and walked on. At the back of first class, a child in 4D began to cry softly, breaking the cabin's quiet for a moment. Charlotte passed by the row quickly, kneeling to calm the parent and offer a soft toy. Her tone was cheerful, composed, all customer service. It was a performance, and she wore it well. But Ariel knew the other face now. She had seen behind the curtain. She had felt the bite of authority when it turns its face toward the vulnerable. Charlotte had abused power, believing no one would check her. She was no longer isolated. Protocol had taken over, quiet and invisible, weaving through the digital systems that Charlotte Whitmore mistakenly believed she understood. Ariel didn't check her secure phone again. She didn't need to. The follow-up notifications wouldn't come through open channels. From here on, her job was to wait and observe. The mechanisms, already in motion, would do what she needed them to. Meanwhile, Charlotte moved through the cabin with the same stiff elegance she had carried since takeoff, still basking in the illusion of authority. She had created a spectacle earlier, sowed distrust through whispers and subtle humiliation, and convinced herself that her efforts had been thorough, her manipulation complete. But what Charlotte didn't realize was that her behavior had sparked more than just passive discomfort. People were watching, some from within the cabin, others from far beyond it. Deep within the headquarters of the International Aviation Authority, A silent alert had reached the operations risk review team. A redacted ping signaling a level 3 identity tag, initiating a passenger safety protocol from inside a commercial flight. The encrypted signature flagged a known, high-level government operative under security protection. No names were attached. No full details were visible. But the tag had weight, and the system acted without question. Moments after the signal arrived, the airline's executive risk manager received a separate alert, marked urgent. He tapped the notification, scrolled through the abbreviated incident entry logged by the lead flight attendant, and frowned. Nothing about it made sense. The language was vague, the timing inconsistent. The fact that it had been filed without a co-attendant witness raised an immediate flag. He tapped his screen and opened a line to the airline's onboard systems integration desk. "Confirm camera feed access for Flight 611, he said. "Full first-class cabin. Audio optional. I want eyes on it now." Within seconds, a secure terminal on his screen loaded a delayed feed from the cabin's passive surveillance system. It didn't capture every angle, but it showed enough. He rewound 2 hours, played back the sequence of interactions between Charlotte and the passenger in seat 1A. No aggression, no raised voices, no visible disturbance. What he saw was something different. A calm passenger. Repeated attempts at engagement. A drink not offered. A meal not served. A bag seized without resistance. A form delivered with forced pressure. His expression hardened. A call was placed. At the same time, elsewhere across the ocean in a secure defense operations office tied to the diplomatic summit Ariel had been en route to attend. A quiet chain reaction was unfolding. Her identity had not yet been revealed on the flight, but behind the scenes, every layer of who she was had already been confirmed. Senior staff had received the ping. They knew her assignment. They knew she was currently airborne. They knew there was a breach in standard treatment. And they also knew Ariel had not contacted them directly because the nature of her role forbade immediate escalation unless absolutely necessary. That made it serious. That made it real. Inside the cockpit of the aircraft, the first officer checked a blinking communication notification on his side console, furrowed his brow, and passed it quietly to the captain. The message was coded in formal protocol, but its meaning was clear. A high-value passenger in first class required silent accommodation and observation. Do not confront. Do not disturb. Do not engage unless instructed. The captain nodded. "Understood," he said, then turned toward the cabin call panel. "No changes to cabin flow," he said into the headset. "Maintain schedule. Notify me of any irregularities." The entire command lasted 15 seconds. It wasn't spoken to the passengers. It wasn't shown on screens. But everything had just changed. Ariel remained seated, her breathing even, her focus steady. She didn't know the extent of the surveillance feed. She didn't know how many executives had reviewed Charlotte's falsified report. But she could feel it in the shift of the air. Something intangible had begun to turn. A subtle weight had lifted, not from her shoulders, but from the silence around her. Charlotte, however, sensed none of it. She passed by Ariel's row again, peering down with what she believed was still the upper hand. She hadn't touched her tablet since submitting the false report. She hadn't received a follow-up, which to her meant success. Her lie had become protocol, or so she thought. In row 3C, the man who had been recording earlier now adjusted his laptop slightly, minimizing the feed he'd captured, but keeping it open in the background. His expression was unreadable, but his focus had shifted. He no longer looked like someone curious about a passenger. He looked like someone collecting evidence. Across the aisle, May stood near the galley curtain, glancing up the aisle with subtle tension. She hadn't bought into Charlotte's narrative from the beginning, but she had followed orders, unsure how far she was allowed to intervene. Now, though, something in her posture said she'd seen enough. When she returned to Ariel's row to offer a warm towel, she knelt instead of standing, placing herself at eye level. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Do you need anything?" Ariel turned her head, met her eyes, and gave the softest shake of her head. "Not yet." May blinked at the phrasing. Not a no, not a yes. Just a delay. It carried weight. She nodded once and rose again. In the rear cabin, a message was being discreetly printed in the in-flight lead crew center. It was marked priority and addressed only to the lead flight supervisor. Conduct no further interventions with 1A. Compliance oversight initiated. Stand by for review. Avoid escalation. The printer beeped. The message fed out. And May, not Charlotte, was the one who retrieved it. She read it. Her eyes widened. Without a word, she folded the page, slid it into her pocket, and walked forward. She found Charlotte standing in the galley, laughing softly with another crew member about a passenger in business class who had spilled wine on his slacks. "You need to see this," May said, voice neutral. She hadn't changed her posture or spoken more than a few words, but the quiet she held had evolved from endurance to authority. She hadn't needed to make herself known to anyone yet because the truth of her identity no longer needed to be spoken aloud. It had already arrived, silently, in a trail of encrypted signals and confidential escalations stretching from cockpit to corporate, from airline oversight to the secure halls of the diplomatic conference awaiting her arrival. The truth was already in the air, and now it was beginning to land. Charlotte Whitmore paced inside the galley, her back turned to the cabin as she reread the message May had given her. Her jaw was tight, her movement stiff, and she glanced over her shoulder every few seconds toward the front of the cabin, where Ariel remained still, expression unreadable. Charlotte couldn't piece together what had shifted, but she could feel it. The narrative she had crafted was no longer holding. She had told herself all flight that this passenger was simply an inconvenience, an anomaly she had every right to manage. She had believed her uniform gave her the power to curate the environment, to protect the integrity of first class as she saw fit. But now, the silence surrounding Ariel had changed. It wasn't compliance anymore. It was control, and Charlotte couldn't explain it. She turned toward May, who stood near the storage cart organizing glasses. "You know who she is?" Charlotte asked in a sharp whisper. May looked up slowly. "I know who she's not," she said, voice even. "She's not the threat you said she was." Charlotte's face tightened. Something's going on. That message, someone's watching this flight. May didn't answer. She didn't need to, because at that moment, the cabin intercom pinged softly, and the captain's voice came through in a low, measured tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our initial descent in approximately 40 minutes. Please remain seated as the cabin crew prepares for landing. Cabin staff, please review all security and comfort checks." The announcement sounded standard, but there was an edge beneath the captain's voice that Ariel picked up instantly. It was the kind of tone that carried layered meaning, meant to deliver two messages at once, one for the passengers and one for those who knew how to listen. Ariel closed her eyes for a moment, breathed in through her nose, and opened them again. Her hand reached slowly into the inner pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a slim black wallet. Not the kind used for credit cards or cash, but a case lined with reinforced stitching and embedded with a biometric chip. She placed it silently on the fold-out tray in front of her, allowing it to sit there in plain view. She didn't open it. She didn't explain it, but its presence was enough. May saw it first. Her eyes flicked to the wallet, lingered, then widened with a silent realization. Charlotte, emerging from the galley a few seconds later, paused as she caught the glint of the case. She froze. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to process what she was seeing. She took a step closer, and Ariel turned her head slowly, meeting Charlotte's gaze with steady calm. No words, no accusations, just the truth, placed between them like a gavel on a judge's bench. Charlotte stared at the case, then at Ariel, and something in her expression broke. A flicker of panic bled through the confidence she had carried since boarding. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. Her breath caught in her throat. Because she knew. She didn't know the full story, but she recognized the case. Only high-level government personnel or international operatives carried those. It wasn't standard. It wasn't decorative. It was a key, a signal, a silent declaration of who Ariel was. And suddenly, the lie Charlotte had written into the report, The accusations she had whispered into the ears of passengers, the narrative she had weaponized for her own sense of control. It all crumbled. She stepped back, her mouth moving, but her voice lost. Ariel reached forward and calmly opened the case. Inside was a diplomatic credential card, its holographic seal shimmering beneath the low light. There was no title, no badge of aggression, just a clean imprint of authority approved by international governance, linked to networks far above the jurisdiction of flight staff or airline bureaucracy. May stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on the card. She began, but Ariel raised a hand gently. It doesn't matter right now, she said quietly. What matters is that your report will reflect what you saw, not what someone else told you. May nodded, her throat tightening. Ariel returned the case to her pocket and looked out toward the window again, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. In the cockpit, a second alert had arrived. The diplomatic flag had been activated visually. That meant confirmation of identity. That meant the airline's on-ground teams were now required to initiate the soft intervention protocol, non-confrontational oversight, post-landing security presence, and a formal inquiry into any passenger or crew member whose behavior could be interpreted as obstruction, intimidation, or false reporting. Charlotte sat in the galley, her body rigid, her fingers shaking slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions, because she already knew what was coming. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be theatrical, but it would be thorough and permanent. Ariel remained in 1A, her expression serene. The passengers around her hadn't seen the credential. They hadn't heard the conversations. Yet her silence screamed louder than the intercom ever could. She had lost her stage, and in her place, a new dynamic ruled. Ariel didn't stand. She didn't move. She didn't confront anyone or issue a single demand. Her authority didn't require volume. She had shown the truth not just through her credentials, but through her refusal to crack under the pressure of sustained hostility. She had taken every attack, every fabricated accusation, and every twisted look without a single outburst, not because she lacked power, but because her power came from something deeper, unshakable clarity of purpose. It resonated now in the stillness around her. The man in 3C, who had been discreetly recording parts of the flight, closed his laptop quietly and adjusted his seat. He had not shared the footage yet, but he knew now that what he had captured was not merely the mistreatment of a passenger, but the unraveling of a lie in real time. He looked toward Ariel and gave a faint nod, not an apology, not even in solidarity, but in respect. May returned with final refreshments, this time walking directly to 1A with deliberate intent. She placed a fresh towel, a sealed bottle of mineral water, and a cloth napkin neatly on the tray table, before stepping back with composure. "We're honored to have had you aboard," she said, her voice hushed but steady. Ariel met her eyes, nodded once, and replied just as quietly, "Thank you for seeing what others didn't." It was not praise. It was acknowledgement, and May's slight bow in return said all that needed saying. Further back in the cabin, whispers had begun again, but they carried a different tone now. The confidence in their assumptions had wavered. The couple in 2A, who once mocked her earlier, looked straight ahead, posture rigid. The businessman in 1B kept glancing toward her and away, as if trying to understand what shift had occurred in the hierarchy he thought was so fixed. Because he had watched a woman be silenced and judged, and now he was watching her be obeyed without a word. The descent continued. The city lights below the clouds began to sparkle as the aircraft broke through the sky cover, revealing a glittering coastline inching closer with every mile. Inside the cockpit, the captain reviewed the last of the updated directives. A quiet message had arrived confirming post-landing presence of 2 federal compliance officers awaiting the flight at the jet bridge. Their presence would not be disclosed to passengers or staff until touchdown, but their task was already clear. Immediate removal of falsified personnel reports, documentation of crew misconduct, and confidential debriefing of the passenger in 1A. Ariel knew this. She recognized the signs. The silence in the cockpit, the change in cabin procedure, the subtle avoidance of further questions. It was the choreography of institutional correction, measured, restrained, clinical. Charlotte, hidden in the rear galley, sat on the crew jump seat, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had tried to rationalize her actions for hours, tried to convince herself that she had followed protocol, that she had protected the dignity of the cabin, that she had seen what others hadn't. But now, with no confirmation of her fabricated report, with the cold eyes of her peers beginning to distance themselves, she could feel the truth closing in like a storm cloud with no horizon in sight. She wanted to speak to May, to ask what she knew, but she could see in the young woman's posture that no comfort would come from that corner now. She wanted to check her tablet, to reread the logs she had submitted, but even that screen now seemed to accuse her. The power she thought she held was no longer hers. And worse, it had never truly belonged to her. Ariel adjusted her coat slightly and sat back. She didn't need to prepare. There was no speech to give, no confrontation to ready. Her presence had already delivered the full response. And in that, there was finality. Not revenge, not even vindication, just the steady return of balance. As the wheels dropped beneath the aircraft, and the gentle rumble of descent shook through the cabin floor, Ariel allowed herself one deep breath. Not relief, not pride, just breath, because she had not been surprised by any of this. Not the hostility, not the lies, not even the silence of the other passengers. She had been tested by these flames before. She had walked through them and emerged unburned. The difference this time was that the fire had caught someone else, not her. As the plane touched down with a smooth skid on the runway, the passengers stirred again, rustling blankets, stretching limbs, peering out windows at the lights of the terminal. Seatbelt signs blinked, and overhead bins clicked open. But in 1A, Ariel remained seated, calm, composed, watchful. Two men in dark suits boarded the aircraft through the forward hatch before any passengers had disembarked. They showed credentials to the purser, then moved forward. They stopped at 1A, nodded respectfully to Ariel, then turned and addressed the lead crew member. "We're here for the flight incident review," one said quietly. "The passenger in question has already been cleared. We'll need to speak to your lead staff before disembark." Her uniform looked the same, pressed, official, adorned with the pin of senior cabin crew. But the weight it once carried had vanished. The sense of control, of authority over the environment, over the narrative, had drained from her. Her steps were slower now, her eyes downcast, and her mind moving in a frantic loop of unanswered questions. She had spent the last few hours operating under the belief that she had made the right call, that everything she'd done was professional, grounded in duty. But now that belief had unraveled thread by thread in the silence that had followed Ariel Monroe's reveal. The moment the credential case hit that tray table, Charlotte had known. She had crossed a line, not one written in policy manuals or passenger conduct rules, but a deeper line, the kind defined not by procedure, but by principle. She had misused her role, weaponized her bias, and had been caught not because someone raised a voice, but because someone raised a standard. The officers escorted her through a secure door and into a debriefing chamber nestled behind airline operations. A gray room, a metal table, a camera recording. Charlotte sat alone on one side, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The interview began without ceremony. "Your name is on a report containing false statements regarding a passenger currently identified as protected diplomatic personnel," one officer said. "The incident has been logged. Video has been reviewed. Do you wish to amend your report before this proceeds further?" Charlotte's mouth went dry. She had spent years learning how to write documentation that covered her decisions. She knew the language, the phrasing that insulated action, that justified suspicion. But this wasn't about interpretation anymore. This was about evidence. She had been watched. The video showed everything. The looks, the withheld service, the fabricated disruption. And worse, it showed Ariel doing absolutely nothing wrong. Charlotte began, but her voice broke. "I believed I was protecting the integrity of the cabin." The officer's expression didn't change. From what? Silence stretched. Charlotte couldn't answer. not without admitting what she didn't want to say aloud, that her reaction hadn't come from concern, but from assumption. That the moment she saw Ariel, something inside her decided that woman didn't belong. Not because of behavior, but because of how she looked. And she had acted on that instinct. The interrogation continued, methodical and clinical. Every decision she had made on that flight was reviewed and dissected. Every word she said, every action taken, without cause. The paper trail she thought protected her now served as evidence of bias. Her future narrowed with each passing minute. Meanwhile, in the arrivals lounge, Ariel Monroe moved through the diplomatic corridor without pause. She wasn't escorted by bodyguards or greeted with applause. There was no visible recognition of her title. But the air around her shifted as staff parted subtly, customs officers stepped aside, and a private agent took her passport without asking unnecessary questions. The world around her responded not to fame, but to designation. She passed through the exit and entered a private sedan already waiting near the curb. The door closed and the vehicle pulled smoothly into traffic. Ariel leaned back against the leather seat, her eyes calm. She didn't look back at the terminal. There was no need. Everything that needed to be addressed was being handled. She had not demanded an apology. She hadn't shouted, protested, or confronted. She had acted with precision, letting the systems in place serve justice, not for revenge, but for principle. What Charlotte had done was not new to Ariel. It was a familiar wound, an echo of 1,000 smaller indignities she had endured and survived. But this time, she had been in a position to expose it completely, to strip the mask from the process, and show the world how easy it was to weaponize authority when left unchecked. Inside the debriefing room, Charlotte's voice grew hoarse. I didn't know who she was. The officer raised a brow. Would it have mattered? Charlotte paused. The truth fell hard. Yes, she whispered. Why? He asked. Another silence. And then, because I wouldn't have done it. The officer nodded, marking something on a tablet. So not because it was wrong, but because she had status. Charlotte lowered her gaze. I didn't think I was being racist. I just thought something didn't feel right. The room chilled. That's the problem, the officer said. It didn't feel right. That's what your whole report was based on, feeling. Not evidence. Not policy. Not protocol. Charlotte sat motionless. She didn't argue anymore. She couldn't. Every defense she'd leaned on for years, tenure, experience, loyalty to company, had evaporated. In its place was only exposure. Outside the room, the airline's legal team was already drafting an internal disciplinary review. The video would be shown at future training modules. The report Charlotte submitted would be used as a cautionary example in staff evaluations. Her name, once associated with professionalism and poise, was now linked to abuse of authority and racial bias cloaked in corporate language. The final recommendation would not be made public, but within weeks, Charlotte would be removed from international service and reassigned pending review. Her career would not end overnight, but it would never recover fully. Every flight she worked after this would carry a shadow. Every interaction would be measured, watched, doubted. And that, Ariel knew, was not punishment, it was consequence. In her hotel suite, overlooking the city skyline where she would soon attend closed-door policy briefings, Ariel unpacked her coat and placed the credential wallet back into her briefcase. She didn't reflect on the flight. The morning after the disciplinary hearing, Charlotte Whitmore sat alone on a wooden bench near Terminal C's employee shuttle stop, the dawn light just beginning to stretch over the tarmac in a soft golden haze. Planes lifted into the sky in the distance, their bellies catching the rising sun as the world around her stirred into motion. She was still in uniform, though her badge had been turned in. Her final assignment had been logged. No more long-haul international flights. No more first-class service. No more elite clientele. She had been reassigned to regional routes, a reassignment that came with no protest, no ceremony, and no exit interview. The message had been clear. Her conduct had not gone unnoticed, and while she had not been fired, the airline had placed her exactly where she could be watched and forgotten. The night before, she had sat in her apartment, replaying everything she had said on that flight, everything she had thought, felt, assumed. And for the first time in her professional life, she hadn't found a single line of defense that felt real. She couldn't tell herself anymore that she had been misled. She couldn't say she had simply followed protocol. What she had done was see a black woman in a space that her instincts told her didn't belong, and she had acted not because of training, but because of perception, because of comfort, because of bias. And when the truth of Ariel Monroe's identity had emerged, it had cracked something deeper than her confidence. It had shattered the illusion that her professionalism could ever justify cruelty. She hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had failed the very principles she thought she embodied. That failure now sat with her like a weight that wouldn't lift. She watched as another group of uniformed crew passed her, greeting each other with quiet morning banter, not looking her way. The bench had become a kind of limbo, a space between who she used to be and what she had become. Charlotte had spent years believing she knew who she was, a steward of excellence, a guardian of decorum, someone who protected the integrity of the spaces she managed. But the flight had exposed the flaw in that image. She had mistaken exclusivity for professionalism. She had confused comfort with correctness. And now, her silence in the aftermath wasn't pride. It was reflection. She wasn't the villain in her own story until she finally saw herself through Ariel's eyes. And what she saw there was not power. It was cowardice. The kind that hides behind rules to justify control. She didn't know what would come next. She wasn't sure if she could ever fly without remembering that moment, without seeing Seat 1A and remembering how she tried to reduce someone to a stereotype. But she knew she owed more than apology. She owed understanding. Across the city, Ariel Monroe stood in the lobby of a marble-lined building near the heart of a diplomatic district. She wore a navy blazer over a slate blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat twist, her demeanor calm and steady. She greeted the front staff with a nod and entered the security bay without needing to show identification. Her credentials had already been logged. The previous day's events had not followed her here. They had not become headlines. They had not leaked across social media. Because her role wasn't public. Her life moved in shadows and strategy, behind closed doors and beneath headlines. But the message of the flight had stayed with her, not as trauma, not even as rage, but as fuel. She had spent her career navigating spaces that didn't expect her. She had learned early that power unclaimed is power surrendered, and she had chosen never to surrender. What happened on that flight hadn't been new, but it had become another line in a long history of challenges met with grace and countered with precision. She didn't need Charlotte's apology. She didn't need public acknowledgement. What she needed was progress. And progress, she believed, happened quietly, in moments when the powerful are forced to see themselves differently. The meeting room she entered was silent and filled with voices from 6 nations. She took her place, opened her notes, and began her presentation with the same voice she had not used on the plane. Calm, exact, commanding, and no one interrupted her. Back at the airport, Charlotte rose from the bench and walked slowly toward the crew shuttle, unsure whether she was ready for her next assignment. It was a short-haul flight, nothing glamorous, no champagne, no business-class theater. But as she walked, her hand brushed the edge of the paper she had folded into her pocket. It was a printout of the final report summary submitted to the airline's ethics board. It didn't list Ariel's name, only the summary of Charlotte's actions and the institutional response. But what struck her most wasn't the outcome, it was the closing sentence. Failure to recognize bias is not an excuse for perpetuating it. She had read that line 10 times the night before. She would likely read it 100 more. Because while the system had held her accountable, the true sentence she carried was the one she had written in her actions. And undoing it would not happen with words. It would happen with choices. The shuttle doors opened. She stepped on board, not with pride, not with shame, but with awareness. And for the first time in a long time, she knew that was a start. The end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot twists? Which moment hit you the hardest? And where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about it. Your feedback helps shape what comes next.